So, as you know, Nigeria's Supreme Court has suspended Friday's cash swap deadline. It's prevented the central bank from enforcing that time limit. It was supposed to be a fairly straightforward exercise. You pay in your old Naira notes and you get the new notes. There wasn't supposed to be any difficulty, certainly not on the scale of the desperation, chaos and hardship that we've seen with fights at ATMs and mob attacks at commercial banks. And now the Supreme Court has waded in, unanimously suspending the deadline till February the 15th, pending a legal challenge from Kaduna, Kogi and Zamfara states. It's brought in a disputatious legal dimension to this issue about who has jurisdiction and whether the central bank should obey or ignore the Supreme Court's ruling. Well, let's put some of that to one of Nigeria's top constitutional and human rights lawyers, Clement Nwankwo, who is also the executive director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center here in Abuja. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Charles.
What's your reaction to this Supreme Court ruling and the argument by the Attorney General Abubakar Malami that the Supreme Court lacks the jurisdiction to rule on the issues raised by the suit?
I think what we've seen the three states do is rely on Section 232 of the Nigerian Constitution and formulated the case they put in court as a dispute between the state and the federal government. And they so very well craftily put it that then gave or made the Supreme Court decide that it has jurisdiction to entertain the matter, and it ruled on an ex parte application brought before it, giving time till the 15th for the federal government to be put on notice and to come to court and argue its own side of the issues. I think that when you have a disputation between the state and the federal government, then of course the courts assume jurisdiction, and any dispute between the federal government and the state government would usually have the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court kick in, and that's what the Supreme Court has said. Now, when you look at all of the issues, when you see what is going on in the streets, when you see the chaos, when you see the breakdown of law and order, when you go into rural communities and you see families starving, when you see people not being able to send their children to school because they can't find the cash to take those children to school, then you can understand why the Supreme Court would assume jurisdiction. It looks like there has been a complete breakdown in the relationship between the two other arms of government, but also between the two tiers of government. And it required the Supreme Court to intervene. And you would say that beyond the legal issues, the Supreme Court felt even a moral obligation to act to help to break the logjam. And it seems to me that this is what has happened.
Well, it does appear, though, that oftentimes the Supreme Court, and indeed the law in general, is driven by cold, hard facts and by the letter of the law. Is it your sense that the Supreme Court has acted outside its jurisdiction or within it?
I would say that the Supreme Court acted on the basis of what the Constitution provides. The applicants in this case, which are three states, have created grounds, legal grounds, to justify the intervention of the Supreme Court. And given what the Constitution says, that where there are disputes between a state or states and the federal government regarding even legal rights, that the Supreme Court assumes original jurisdiction. So it would seem to me that on that ground, the Supreme Court has assumed jurisdiction, but it would seem to me also that the Supreme Court may not have been acting on cold facts. It may also be acting on what is evident, which is really a near breakdown of law and order. You would see how citizens in desperation are attacking banks, and for me, those banks are just as much victims as citizens themselves. If they had cash, it would seem to me they would dispense of it. But when you also watch what the central bank has said, it says that it estimates a certain amount of money to be money or cash in circulation. It has withdrawn 2 trillion of that money. There is no evidence from the central bank about how much it has put in to replace the money withdrawn. Some speculations that it has only put in 300 billion naira into the banking system. So if you've withdrawn 2 trillion and you are putting in only 300 billion, then you can see where the problem is. And that is the fact that the Central Bank of Nigeria has very little understanding of the implications of a policy that it has kicked in at this time, especially with elections approaching. And there are different dimensions that makes you even question whether this policy will not be a threat to the election.
Right. Well, I want to get to all that in a minute, but I need to get this, your interpretation, your legal interpretation of this, because we have the opportunity of having you here. Can the central bank, given that it also has its own the empowerment by the law, I mean, it has its own provisions within the law, can it ignore this ruling, as some have suggested, because it has the power by law to act independently and because it's not a party to this suit?
What you do have is you do have policies that the government sets, fiscal policies. You do have other implementation policies, and the federal government is responsible for monetary policies, even if the central bank is an agency under it. And what the states have done, if you look at the formulation of the case, they have formulated it in a way that puts the central bank as part of the federal government and created a dispute between the states and the federal government. And the central bank itself has a board of governors, a board of directors, and the federal government is represented in this board. In what has happened is that the central bank is defined as part of the federal government, and that's the premise under which the Supreme Court has assumed jurisdiction in this matter. If the Supreme Court has made a pronouncement, even if in error, the central bank has a duty to obey the order of the central of the Supreme Court.
Right, and this issue is because, I mean, there's again a question of definition that I've heard sort of put about the place. This issue of the Supreme Court being able to wade in a case between the states and the federal government, it's not the states versus the federation, it's the states versus the federal government. Is that right?
That's what it is.
Right. And do you see the Supreme Court, because we've heard the Attorney General obviously questioning the jurisdiction and returning to the same court, apparently. Do you see the Supreme Court reversing itself on this decision, and on whether it has jurisdiction? Because it looks like the Attorney General, as I said, is questioning the jurisdiction in this matter and is heading to the same Supreme Court on that legal question, because it has now become a question of jurisdiction, hasn't it?
Well, the Attorney General is doing what he should do, which is to go back to the Supreme Court. Don't forget the order was made ex parte, and he has now been put on notice. All the parties have been asked to return to court. And so the Attorney General has done what he should do. The Supreme Court may, in fact, interpret its actions or even the question of jurisdiction differently, to say, oh, we have no jurisdiction. But it would seem to me, and that's why I make the point, that it's the Supreme Court is you might say cold hard facts, but the justices are part of the society. And where there are disputes between the different agencies or organs of government, and it would seem to me that given the deterioration of law and order that this policy is bringing about, is coming through, that the central bank acting the way that it has means that beyond the cold hard fact, it's also acting in the national interest.
Well, that's a very good point, because I was going to come to that point you made at the outset I was going to come to it peripherally, because I wonder how much politicization has taken place and how that's affected the Supreme Court. Because I'm wondering if it can be said that beyond the law and the issue of jurisdiction, this issue has been politicized to the extent that the Supreme Court has now been brought into that politicization and is now acting within that and within the scope, as you said earlier, of the public interest beyond any legal basis for or against jurisdiction, and whether that is actually permissible.
Well, it's not permissible that the Supreme Court should descend into the arena of politics. Unfortunately, some decisions that we have seen come from the Supreme Court may have been interpreted as tainted with politics. But as a lawyer and as someone who has worked in the area of respect for rule of law and the institutions of rule of law, it is important for me, and I think for everyone who wants to see a due process in this country, continue to enunciate the importance of the integrity of the court system. And that's why it is important to look at this particular decision from that point of view.
And do you think that this intervention by the Supreme Court could further inflame this already heated up situation in Nigeria as the elections approach? You touched on this briefly, or do you think that it's likely to douse the flames?
I think what people want is cash. What people want is money to be able to spend. And, you know, the people most affected by these are the poorest of the poor. These are people who don't have bank accounts. And so the central bank's indication that it is doing this to promote a cashless economy, I think makes no sense. A lot of these people have to trade on a daily basis, have no access to even banking systems. The banking system is almost collapsing. A lot of people lose money every day from the very antiquated banking apps and banking technology that exist in this country. There is no one who would say that they've not lost money on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, using ATM cards, using the POS system, losing money in the process of transfer between banks and transfer over transactions. And so when people go through all of that experience, and you are saying and insisting that they must use the ATM or use the POS, some people don't even have as much as 100 Naira in their account. They make a purchase of 5 Naira, they use the ATM system, they lose it because the money neither arrives at the destination is sent or not. So all of this crisis is something that a lot of us feel that the central bank needs to invest time and money in solving. And when you don't do that, you don't have a platform or banking technology that assists smooth use of technology, and then you insist on a cashless system, then I think that you are really, really inflaming anger and passion.
Okay, well, let's return to the political elements of this, because a lot of people are getting nervous by this move by some states, particularly given that all the states are APC states. There is a question being asked about whether or not in the same circumstance, well, obviously not similar circumstances, but in the same sort of legal environment, whether states can go to the Supreme Court and ask the Supreme Court to change the date, for example, of the election, making the argument that, you know, for whatever reason, that they want the date changed. I mean, can they, you know, unless, or does there have to be a dispute? Because they could say, well, there's a dispute. We don't agree with the date of the election.
Dates of election are set by the Constitution. The Constitution further gives the National Assembly powers to make law pursuant to the Constitution, which is why the Electoral Act is made. And so it would seem to me to be completely out of place for anyone to go to interfere with those constitutionally defined parameters for holding elections, and it would be outrageous for any state to approach the courts on election matters or ask courts to interfere with dates already set for elections.
Yeah, but what about Anambra State or Imo State, where there's been some issues? I mean, you know, in terms of security and all the rest of it, can they go to the Supreme Court and say, on the basis of this, can you postpone the elections?
No, the Electoral Act is quite clear on conditions for postponing elections. Even the Constitution is quite clear respecting it. And those even define security situations and where you do have a question that it is impossible to hold elections because of security reasons. The Constitution provides even that you could then postpone elections, and in the Electoral Act it says for cogent and verifiable reasons. So all these things are already defined within the existing laws, and it would not then be up to the Supreme Court to make new laws respecting this.
Right, okay. Well, let's stay with that political theme, because I'm wondering what your sense is of how the APC and its presidential candidate Bola Ahmed Tinubu figure in all of this. Do you think that there is an element of sort of personal interest, or do you see genuine concern for the impact of this Naira redesign on the people of Nigeria? Because quite a lot of conflicting reactions to this issue from the same government and party.
Well, I think that what is quite clear is that politicians know, and everyone knows, in fact, that elections require money. If I was running for president, I would be thinking, how do I deploy polling agents to 176,000 plus polling units? I would be thinking, how do I pay them? And I don't think that any candidate should pretend that one person is more affected by this than the other. Of course, there's a narrative out there about vote buying and the rest of it, and why the central bank may have thought that this would help deal with the problem of vote buying. But who did the central bank discuss with? Why do you become a self-appointed participant in election management? If the central bank feels that it wants to curb vote buying, then did INEC speak to the central bank? Did they sit down with INEC and say, okay, a central bank, this would be your contribution to it? And you saw in the social media new notes being sprayed in bundles. These politicians who are running for office own banks. And that's why some of these monies are not even coming out to the public.
Yeah, but is the date for elections set by the Constitution? Because it doesn't actually do that, doesn't it? It's INEC that sets the date, doesn't it? I mean, it kind of creates a parameter within which INEC then sets the date.
The Constitution says that, for example, that the date for the general election shall be no earlier and no later. And it gives a bracket of 150 days and 30 days. So INEC is required to fall within that parameter. Right. And then the Electoral Act says that the notice for a general election must be issued no less than 360 days to the date of the election, which is why INEC had announced the days that it did in February of 2022, counting to 360 days. So these are well-defined dates. But we have seen in this country that elections dates were altered. We saw that in 2011. We saw that in 2015. We saw that in 2019. And what we in civil society are hoping and advocating against is seeing this become a regular feature of our elections. Dates have been set. Everyone has a responsibility to perform. Those dates should not be tampered with, and that's the point that we have all been making.
So what sort of long-term effects do you think all this is likely to have on the authority of the Supreme Court and the independence of the central bank?
I think that, again, the courts are established to be arbiters, but also arbiters for justice. And if you are a Supreme Court and you see videos of Nigerians spreading all over the world, of Nigerians stripping naked in banking halls, struggling, fighting, people dying, queuing for, some are not queuing for big money, some are queuing for 5,000 naira, some are queuing for 1,000 naira. Then it tells you how desperate. You know, Charles, you and I are not in those queues because we can find a way of surviving. Some of these people are the poorest of the poor. And if you are a central bank making policies that inflict so much incredible pain and hardship on citizens, then I don't think you have thought through your policy. And if you're a Supreme Court and you are seeing this pain, hardship, you would consider it to be cruelty.
Right.
And you would act.
So in the context of everything you've said, what does it look like to you as elections draw near?
I think it's important. Yesterday we saw the electoral chief meeting with Central Bank, and Central Bank giving assurances that there will be cash for INEC to work. So why would you make cash available to INEC? I have to go to a polling unit. If it's too far away, I would need to enter transportation to get there. If it's actually that I registered in a different state, if I registered in my home state, for instance, I would need to travel to my home state. Are you going to give special cash to people who have to travel through transport means, paying huge sums of money to go to their locations to go to vote? So that's really my worry about this policy, that it could, in fact, create challenge for the elections. And let me say something else as well. It could actually, ironically, increase vote buying, because if politicians were paying 5,000 for a vote, and now they have the new currency, and the voters are desperate for the new currency, they would accept a discount.
Right.
So
Okay.
for me, I just think it's a policy that's not been thought through at all, and should not be applied in the light of elections going on. And you have to think through what you want to do. You can't withdraw 2 trillion naira of a system and only print 300 billion naira notes. That's what the problem is. You've got to put the money in the banking system, and you've got to let people have access to their funds. That's
Right.
what the crisis is.
Okay. Clement, I want to thank you very much indeed. It's been very enlightening talking with you. And Clement is one of Nigeria's top constitutional and human rights lawyers. He's also the executive director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center here in Abuja. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Phil.